June 18, 1944. 6:37 p.m. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smoke hit them first. Thick, sweet, unmistakably rich. It drifted across the open yard in slow curls, weaving through the evening heat like a scent carried from another world. 32 German women stepped out of the transport truck, boots sinking into Texas dust, wrists trembling from exhaustion and the long Atlantic crossing. But the smell, God, the smell, stopped them cold. They stood there blinking, eyes adjusting to the low sun hanging like molten copper over the camp. Beyond the fences and guard towers, the source of the smoke revealed itself. American cowboys in sweat-stained denim, boots planted wide, turning massive ribeye steaks on a row of iron grills that stretched almost the length of a barracks wall. Not even German civilians had seen beef like this for years, but here in Texas, the enemy was grilling it for prisoners. Helene Bauer, 21, former auxiliary radio operator from Hamburg, gripped the strap of her cloth bag until her knuckles whitened. The size of the meat slabs felt absurd, unreal, like something from pre-war festivals or the pages of an American postcard her brother once smuggled home. The steaks glistened under the sun, edges charred, juices hissing as fat dripped into the flames. Behind her, one of the older women whispered, "Impossible. We haven't had meat in months." Another added, voice thin with disbelief, "Berlin ration cards barely give us potatoes now." But here, on the soil of their enemy, cowboys were flipping steaks as if feeding honored guests. A gust of wind rolled across the compound, lifting the women's thin hair and sending fresh waves of aroma over them. Pepper, smoke, salt, something sweet they could not quite name. It wrapped around their empty stomachs like a warm hand. A few women swayed lightly, just from the shock of smelling real food again. The cowboys didn't seem in any hurry. One whistled a tune. Another tipped his hat at an American guard walking past. A third, a tall man with a sun-cracked face, stabbed a ribeye with his fork, inspected the color, nodded with satisfaction and laid it gently onto a tray already piled with meat. Helene stared in silence. This couldn't be right. This couldn't be for them. Back in Europe, the world was splitting apart. German cities were skeletal ruins. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Berlin had rationed food down to starvation levels, 700 to 900 calories a day, barely enough to keep an adult alive. Civilians tore up flower beds in city squares to grow cabbage and beets. Entire families survived on watery soup made from turnip peel. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States was moving at a different pace, industrial strength rising like a steel mountain. America was producing 96,000 aircraft a year, more than all its enemies combined. Its meat industry supplied over 20 million tons of beef and pork annually. American farms ran with such surplus that they could feed their own troops fighting on two fronts, supply their allies, and still serve full meals to thousands of captured enemies. The contrast felt obscene. A female POW at the back muttered, "Why? Why would they waste this on us?" But nothing about the scene suggested waste. The cowboys treated it like routine work, the kind they'd done long before the war, seasoning, flipping, feeding hungry mouths because that was simply what decent men did in Texas. Across the yard, prisoners in denim blue work uniforms emerged from barracks, drawn by the smell, lining up calmly near the mess hall. The women stiffened. None had been prepared for this. They had expected the things propaganda promised: gruel, beatings, humiliation. Not steak, not men who looked at them with the indifference of ranch hands feeding the hired crew after a long day. One of the guards motioned toward the women. "All right, ladies," he said evenly. "Let's get you in line. Supper's almost ready." Supper, as if they were just people, not enemies, not prisoners from the collapsing Reich, just people who needed to eat. Helene felt her heart pound beneath her ribs. The sun lowered, painting the grills in gold and shadow, and for the first time since her capture, she sensed something far more destabilizing than fear. Not cruelty, Not threats, but abundance. A land so plentiful, so confident in its strength, that it fed the enemy with the same food Americans ate themselves. And somewhere deep inside, a thought she wasn't ready to admit took root. If America could feed its prisoners like this, what else about the war had been a lie? For a long moment, the women did not move. The smell of roasted beef drifted across the yard in slow, heavy waves, wrapping around their empty stomachs like a cruel trick. But instead of stepping forward, instead of lining up with the others, the 32 women froze, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. Helene felt the muscles in her neck tighten. She had expected starvation, humiliation, maybe even violence. But this impossible abundance, felt far more dangerous. No one spoke at first. Dust swirled around their boots, the cowboy grills crackled, and the last Texas sunlight sank low behind the barracks. It should have been a peaceful scene. A normal evening in the middle of America. A country that looked untouched by war. But the women's minds were still trapped in Europe, still echoing with the voices of Nazi instructors, political commissars, and camp directors who had shaped their beliefs for years. Finally, Margaret, the oldest among them, broke the silence. "It must be a trap," she whispered. Heads nodded. It was the only explanation that made sense to them. The Reich had been very clear about what awaited German women if captured by Americans. Americans torture prisoners. Americans starve captives like animals. Americans experiment on women. Americans are racially weak, morally corrupt, desperate to humiliate Germans. These weren't rumors. These were phrases spoken with authority, blared from radio broadcasts, printed on posters, repeated in training halls. Women in the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps heard it so often that it became a kind of mental armor. Better to die in battle than fall into American hands. And now, here they stood in Texas, staring at ribeye steaks thicker than anything their families had seen since 1939. Ingrid pressed a hand to her stomach as it growled loudly, betraying her fear. She swallowed and whispered, "They want to poison us. They will watch to see who breaks first." The idea spread through the group instantly, like a spark thrown into dry grass. Another woman muttered, "This is not food, it is a psychological test." "We are being fattened like animals," someone else said. "They want us to lower our guard." Their voices overlapped, thin, brittle, trembling. No one dared take a single step closer to the mess hall. The steaks smoked behind them, hissing softly, filling the air with a smell so foreign and warm it almost hurt. Helene's mind flashed back to Berlin. Not the city she grew up in, but the burned-out shell it had become by 1944. She remembered walking along Unter den Linden and seeing women lined up for hours just to buy a few beets. She remembered her mother dividing a single potato into 3 portions, pretending she wasn't hungry. In the last months before her capture, entire neighborhoods survived on turnip peels and thin soups barely seasoned with salt. She had heard stories of families boiling wallpaper glue for calories. Her father once traded a treasured violin just to get a handful of barley. Yet here, thousands of miles away, American soldiers tossed perfectly good chunks of beef fat into metal buckets as waste. The contrast was so obscene, so grotesque, that it made her dizzy. Behind her, Margaret's voice trembled as she recalled the spring of '44. "Berlin is starving," she said. "The elderly collapse in bread lines. Children faint in school. And we are prisoners, yet they offer us meat?" She shook her head violently. No, this cannot be real." The younger women looked at her as if she were the only anchor left, because if they accepted what they were seeing, not as trickery, not as manipulation, but as kindness, then everything they had ever believed about America would collapse in one blow. And belief was the only thing they still had. A guard approached from behind the fence, his posture relaxed, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. "Ladies, supper's ready," he said. The women flinched. Not because of his tone, but because he spoke to them as though speaking to paying guests in a restaurant. No barked orders, no threats, no arrogance, just normalcy. The guard gestured toward the mess hall. "You'll eat the same as our men. Step on up." The words washed over them like something impossible. The same as our men, not slave food, not scraps, not punishment, but dinner, shared, equal, human. Helene's pulse quickened. Her mind raced to make sense of it. Why would America feed us well? Why would they waste their own food? Why treat us like humans? Her training offered no answers. Propaganda had prepared her for brutality, not generosity. A few women exchanged terrified glances. The situation was slipping out of their control. Kindness, real or perceived, was far more destabilizing than cruelty. Cruelty would have confirmed everything they expected. Cruelty was familiar. But this softness, this abundance, this strange American confidence, it felt unbearable. Somewhere behind the guards, a radio crackled from the administrative building. A news report drifted faintly across the yard. American GDP now surpassing the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Factories operating 24 hours a day. Record harvests. The women couldn't understand every word, but they understood the tone. America was not struggling. America was not starving. America was not desperate. America was winning, and winning with full plates. A cowboy at the grill turned toward them, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You ladies comin' or not?" he called out, not unkindly. "Steaks ain't getting any hotter." The casualness of it nearly broke Helene. She didn't know whether to run or cry. Behind her, several women huddled closer together, whispering rapidly, "They're mocking us. They want to show how weak we are. They want to see who behaves like an animal. They want us to beg." But nothing in the cowboy's posture suggested mockery. They weren't even looking at the women, just focused on seasoning and flipping meat like they would for a ranch crew after a long day's work. Helene felt something shift inside her. A terrifying thought, one she didn't dare voice, began forming at the edges of her consciousness. What if there is no trick? What if Americans simply feed their prisoners? The idea was so alien, so incompatible with everything she'd been taught, that her whole body tensed in resistance. If it were true, then she would have to question not only the Reich, but herself. She swallowed hard. The smell of beef clung to the back of her throat, rich and overwhelming. Around her, the women remained frozen, caught between hunger and fear, indoctrination, and the undeniable reality sizzling on the grill. For the first time since landing in America, Helene felt something colder than fear. She felt doubt. And for the women of Camp Hearn, that doubt marked the beginning of a new kind of terror. Because if America could feed its prisoners with generosity, what else about the enemy had they been wrong about? The women were still frozen in place when the nearest cowboy stepped away from the grill and walked toward them. His boots crunched softly across the gravel, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of the fire behind him. He wore a sun-faded shirt, sleeves rolled high on his forearms, and a Stetson hat that looked older than some of the prisoners. He didn't move quickly, didn't swagger, didn't angle himself to intimidate. Instead, he lifted his hands slightly, palms open, the universal gesture of, I mean no harm. "Ladies," he drawled, voice warm as the evening air. "Y'all need to eat. Nothing tricky here." The women stiffened, every muscle tightening in suspicion. They didn't understand all his words, but they understood his tone. Gentle, unhurried, almost fatherly. It clashed horribly with everything they expected American men to be. Cruel, mocking, dangerous. Helene exchanged a look with Ingrid. It was the kind of look that said, if this is an act, he's very good at it. Behind the cowboy, another man stepped forward. Tall, wide-shouldered, a strip of beef skewered on a long fork. He didn't say anything. Instead, he lifted the ribeye to his own mouth and took a slow bite. Chewed, swallowed. Then he shrugged as if to say, "See." Alive. He set the fork down, wiped his hands on a cloth, and returned to flipping steaks. The women were stunned into silence. No speeches, no mocking, just calm demonstration. Helene felt her breath catch in her throat. She had seen officers in the Luftwaffe explain dangerous tasks. She had seen German cooks taste test soup in case supplies had spoiled. But she had never seen a guard, an enemy guard, eat food simply to reassure prisoners. The first cowboy scratched his jaw and tipped his hat back. "Y'all been on a long trip. You eat same as our boys tonight." The words washed over them like something surreal. Same as our boys. Not leftovers, not scraps, not humiliation rations. Equal. Another gust of wind stirred the smoke, and the women winced as the scent hit them again. Thick, rich, unbearably tempting. Behind them, their stomachs growled like a small chorus. A third cowboy approached, balancing a mug of coffee in one hand. He sipped it, sighed contentedly, and nodded toward the mess hall. "In Texas," he said, "hungry folks get fed. Doesn't matter who you are." He said it the way a man might say the sky is blue or water is wet. A simple truth, an unbreakable rule, a piece of cultural DNA passed down through generations of men who had raised cattle long before war ever touched Europe. One of the younger POWs, her voice barely louder than a breath, whispered, They don't seem angry." "They don't seem to hate us," another added. Hate would have been easy to understand. Predictable. Safe. But the cowboys' calm, almost casual hospitality made their hearts race in a different way, like stepping into a warm room after believing for months that every door would lead to an execution chamber. The guard from earlier motioned again. "Step on up, ladies." No pressure, no raised voice. Just an offer. Some of the women took a tiny step forward. One. Then another. Helene didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind swirled with contradictions. The Reich had promised torture. Berlin had promised chains. Her commanding officer had sworn Americans were animals. But these Texans? They were acting like neighbors, like hosts, like men who were feeding a harvest crew, not guarding enemy soldiers. To the Americans, hospitality wasn't strategy. To the women, hospitality felt like sorcery. A cowboy sitting on a crate near the mess hall took a long sip of coffee and called out, "Food's hot, sun's going down. Y'all better hustle or the flies'll get it first." The remark drew a few chuckles from the American guards. Even a few of the German women startled, because for half a second it sounded like something their uncles back home might have said. A simple human irritation with flies, nothing more. Helene finally took a step forward. As she did, one thought struck her with the force of a blow. This is how they see us. Not as enemies. Just as people who need to eat dinner. It was overwhelming. The women shuffled toward the mess hall in a hesitant line. They clutched their bags tight, watching every movement around them. But the Americans barely seemed to notice their anxiety. They were too busy working, carrying trays, pouring water, slicing bread, seasoning meat. Inside the mess hall, the scene was even more disorienting. Long tables, warm lights, plates already set, and on each plate, identical portions to those served to American GIs. Thick slices of beef, cornbread, mashed potatoes, a scoop of beans, and a small square of something that looked suspiciously like cake. Some of the women gasped aloud. Cake. Ingrid covered her mouth with both hands. "Gott im Himmel," she whispered. "This is for us." A guard overheard and smiled. "Sure is. Can't let y'all waste away on us." The women stared at him as if he had spoken an alien language. Americans had enough food to feed their prisoners cake. Cake. In 1944, while back home, German mothers scraped burned flour off the bottom of ruined ovens. Helene's knees felt weak. Across the room, the cowboy with the Stetson reappeared. He placed a tray on a table and leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching them with a kind of easy contentment. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't pity. It was simply what a man felt when he knew he was doing the right thing. America, by that summer, was a machine of staggering abundance. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh roared day and night. Women in coveralls, Rosie the Riveters, were assembling bombers at an assembly line every hour. Farms across the Midwest produced more wheat, corn, beef, and milk than any country in history. The nation's GDP towered over the economies of the Axis, and every bit of that strength, the coal, the steel, the gasoline, the rations, was being used not only to win the war, but to uphold something older, the American belief that decency is not conditional. It wasn't softness, it wasn't weakness, it was confidence. A quiet strength so deep that it could afford to be generous. The German women didn't know any of this in detail, not yet, but they felt it instinctively. They felt it in the way the cowboys served them without hesitation. They felt it in the way the guards spoke to them with simple civility. They felt it in the warm food laid out on the table, steaming in the yellow light. Helene finally sat down. Her hands trembled as she touched the fork. A cowboy nearby noticed and said softly, "Ma'am, you're safe here." Safe. She hadn't felt safe since 1939. The women looked around the table, their disbelief slowly cracking under the weight of sensory reality. Generosity was not what they were prepared for, but generosity didn't care about fear. The first cowboy tipped his hat once more. "Eat up, ladies. Texas hospitality don't care what uniform you wore." And in that simple act, in that effortless kindness, the women of Camp Hearn began their first lesson in American truth. Kindness here wasn't a tactic, it was a way of life, and nothing in the world frightened them more than that. For a full minute, no one moved. The women sat at the long wooden tables, hands hovering over forks, eyes locked on plates that looked like artifacts from another life. Steaming beef, warm bread, potatoes whipped smooth, beans cooked slow with onions and spices. The smell alone felt like it could shatter them. Helene's throat tightened. She stared at the slice of ribeye in front of her, its edges crisp, the center soft, pink, and glistening. Her hand trembled as she lifted her fork. Around her, chairs creaked as the other women struggled to steady themselves. It was Ingrid who finally whispered what all of them were thinking. I don't remember the last time I saw real meat." No one answered. They didn't have to. They all shared the same memory. Long ration lines, hollow faces, soup so thin you could see the bottom of the pot, mothers lying to their children by saying they had already eaten. And now, this. Helene brought the fork to her lips. The moment the meat touched her tongue, her eyes flew open. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, fat, the faint sweetness of smoke. But it wasn't the flavor that undid her. It was the memory that slammed into her so hard she nearly fell from her chair. She was 8 years old again, standing in her grandparents' farmhouse kitchen in Bavaria, her grandmother humming while stirring a pot of stew, the smell of beef filling the room, her father laughing as he carved Sunday roast, her mother brushing flour off her apron. A world that felt warm, safe, intact. A world that no longer existed. The fork slipped from her fingers. Her breath hitched. And then, it came. A sob, sudden and violent, tore out of her chest. She covered her mouth with both hands, shoulders shaking. The other POWs jerked their heads toward her, startled, then terrified, because if one of them broke, what did that mean for the rest? Helene tried to breathe, but the memories kept hitting her one after another. The bombings, the hunger, her father's gaunt face, her mother dividing half a potato into 3 slices. And then, this. A warm meal in the enemy's country. A kindness painful enough to feel like cruelty. The sound of her crying spread through the room like a fracture running through ice. Across the table, Frida set her knife down slackly and pressed her palms to her eyes. Her voice cracked. Why? Why are you treating enemies like this? She wasn't asking the women. She was asking the room. She was asking the universe. A cowboy standing near the doorway looked up, utterly bewildered. Another girl, barely 19, took one bite, let out a small gasp, and immediately burst into tears so hard her shoulders shook the way children do when they're finally safe after hours of fear. 2 more women followed, tears falling silently. Not delicate tears, but the kind that come from years of holding everything in. Someone, further down the table, whispered in German, "This feels like a trick." But even she sounded unsure because tricks didn't smell like home. Tricks didn't give you warm bread. Tricks didn't taste like memories of your mother's kitchen before the war ripped the world open. Helene's breathing grew shallow. Her vision blurred. The room tilted slightly as heat rushed through her body. She tried to speak, but only managed a broken, "Ich kann nicht," and then she fainted. Her chair scraped sharply against the floor as she collapsed sideways. The room exploded into motion. Women shouting her name, hands grabbing at her sleeves, a gasp from the back table. A cowboy dropped his coffee so fast the mug shattered. "Whoa! Whoa! Someone get the medic." He rushed to Helene's side, kneeling beside her. His movements were clumsy, panicked. Not the careful choreography of a torturer, but the frantic worry of a man who genuinely feared for her safety. "Ma'am?" he said softly, tapping her cheek. "Hey, can you hear me?" His drawl, normally slow and steady, now wavered with concern. The medic arrived within seconds, pushing through the crowd of trembling POWs. He checked her pulse, lifted her wrist, examined her eyes. "She's fine," he finally said. "Shock. Malnutrition. Probably hasn't eaten real food in months." The cowboy exhaled with relief. "Lord have mercy," he muttered. "We were just trying to feed him." Another cowboy, standing helplessly with his hat in his hands, spoke into the stunned silence. "Ma'am, it's just dinner. Just dinner." But to these women, it felt like the collapse of everything they had been taught. One of the guards helped lift Helene back into her seat. As she slowly regained consciousness, her first instinct wasn't to pull away or scream. She reached for the table, fingers brushing the edge of the plate as if to confirm it was still real. More women began eating, though their hands shook so badly some could barely keep hold of their forks. Tears streamed down faces that had learned to stay stone-hard since 1940. Some took small bites, others devoured their food with desperate, trembling urgency. A few sobbed after every swallow, as if each taste reminded them of everything they had lost and everything they were now being offered by the very people they had been told were monsters. The room filled with soft weeping, forks clinking gently against plates, and the low hum of cowboys murmuring reassurances they didn't know how to give. Frida, cheeks streaked with tears, lifted her head and asked again, this time directing her voice at the cowboy nearest her. Why are you treating enemies like this?" The cowboy hesitated. He wasn't used to explaining Texas values in words. He scratched his chin, searching for something simple, something true. Finally, he spoke. "Well, ma'am, in Texas, when folks are hungry, you feed 'em, enemy or not." The women stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. Maybe he had, because that sentence, gentle, uncomplicated, honest, struck harder than any bullet, any threat, any battle. It was a truth delivered so plainly, it cracked whatever remained of the armor they had carried across an ocean. One by one, the POWs lowered their heads over their plates, tears dripping onto the warm food, not because of fear, not because of danger, but because kindness, this deep hurt. It hurt in the places where memories of home still lived. It hurt in the places war had hollowed out. Helena finally stopped crying long enough to take another bite, and as she chewed, a thought whispered through her mind, quiet, trembling, undeniable. This country, this enemy, is nothing like what we were told. And that realization, far more than hunger, far more than fear, was the thing that truly broke them. The next morning, the women woke before the bugle sounded. They had barely slept. Some lay awake replaying the taste of the meal. Rich, smoky, impossibly tender, trying to make sense of it. Others stared at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the distant hum of trucks and the rhythmic clanging of pots from the mess hall, wondering if the previous night had been a hallucination born of hunger. Helene sat on the edge of her bunk, clutching the small notebook she had smuggled from France. She hadn't written in it since her capture. Nothing had seemed worth recording. Not the fear, not the humiliation, not the endless transport. But now her fingers trembled as she opened to a blank page. She wrote only one line. "The enemy is feeding us better than our own country." The words looked impossible on paper, wrong, treasonous, and yet undeniably true. Outside, dawn spilled across the Texas plains in soft pink and gold. A thin mist hovered over the fields beyond the fences where cattle grazed lazily, tails flicking at flies. A truck rumbled past, carrying bags of flour and crates of fresh vegetables toward the kitchen. Food. Always food here. Food everywhere. As the women filed out of their barracks for roll call, they passed a group of American soldiers heading to the trucks for transport duty. The men looked tired but well-fed, laughing among themselves about letters from home. One carried a photograph tucked into his breast pocket, a wife holding a baby. Another had a lunch tin, stuffed so full the lid barely stayed shut. It struck the women with the force of a blow. Even the men going into danger ate better than German civilians. The thought lingered like a shadow. After roll call, the women were escorted to the yard for morning routine. The cowboys from the night before were already at work, cleaning the grills, stacking firewood, sipping from metal cups of steaming coffee. One spotted them and tipped his hat in recognition. "Mornin', ladies." Some of the women murmured replies. Others ducked their heads, unsure how to respond to friendly gestures from men they were still trying to understand. But the cowboys didn't seem offended. They were too busy working, moving with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of men who had spent their lives outdoors. Helene watched them quietly, something shifting inside her. These men didn't look like the monsters propaganda had promised. They didn't leer or threaten. They didn't enjoy power or punishment. They simply worked, cleaning, cooking, repairing fences, feeding prisoners, because that was their job, and because something deeper than orders guided them. A cowboy with a scar across his jaw caught Helene staring and nodded politely. "You sleep all right? Food didn't upset your stomach, did it?" She blinked, startled. "No. It was good," she managed in halting English. He grinned. "Well, we got more coming tonight. Pork ribs. Y'all never had Texas ribs? You're in for a treat." She couldn't respond. Her throat felt too tight. The amount of food they fed their enemies, the effort they put into preparing it, the casualness of it all. Nothing in her upbringing could explain it. Later that morning, during chores in the women's compound, Margaret sat on a bench with her tin cup of water, staring into the distance. She had lived through the worst of Berlin's hunger. She had watched people fight in the streets over rotten potatoes. She had seen mothers trade family heirlooms for a few onions. She whispered to Helene, voice hoarse, "Chung ta tua kong fai vi sung ma vi ho ma bang long han ai." Helene closed her eyes, the words settling heavily in her chest. Back in Germany, they had been told that weakness was fatal, that mercy was a flaw, that compassion was a disease. But here, on the other side of the world, they found an enemy who considered mercy a strength, a weapon even, a kind of quiet power Germany could never match. That afternoon, the women were assigned to laundry duty near the main yard. From where they worked, they could see the camp's internal road leading toward the gates. A long convoy of trucks was preparing to depart, loaded with crates of supplies, fuel, and mail. A guard noticed the women watching and explained almost casually, 12 million Americans are deployed overseas. Supplies gotta keep moving day and night." He pointed toward the horizon. "Factories back home don't sleep. Rosie the Riveter's probably beating her hammer as we speak." Helene remembered the American posters she'd seen in occupied France. Strong women in bandanas, sleeves rolled up, smiling with confidence. She learned now that those posters weren't empty slogans. They represented millions of real women working in factories, building the planes and ships that filled the skies and seas. A nation where women built bombers and men fed prisoners steak. It was dizzying to imagine. As they worked, a distant radio played news from across the country. War bond drives breaking records, volunteers knitting socks for troops, schoolchildren collecting scrap metal, families rationing willingly so soldiers and prisoners alike could eat. A country united, not by fear, but by belief. Belief in doing the right thing. By late afternoon, the sun hung low and hot over the compound, pressing against the women's backs as they hung wet laundry on the lines. Sweat dripped from their temples. Their arms ached. But for the first time in weeks, they did not feel the quiet despair that had clung to them like a shadow since their capture. Because every small moment, every plate of food, every polite nod, every casual kindness was rewriting the world inside their minds. As they began returning the laundry carts, the cowboy with the scar approached again, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ladies," he said gently, "I hear yesterday was a bit overwhelming. Didn't mean to spook y'all." Margaret cleared her throat. "It was unexpected." He nodded thoughtfully, then squatted to be closer to eye level, forearms resting on his knees. "We feed people because it's right," he said simply. "Not because they deserve it." Helene felt her breath leave her body. He wasn't speaking for effect. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was stating a truth he had lived his whole life. And suddenly she understood something that pierced deeper than any propaganda, any speech, any order she had ever heard. America did not treat them kindly because they were prisoners. America treated them kindly because America believed kindness was strength. In a broken voice, Frida whispered, "We were taught that mercy is weakness." The cowboy shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. Mercy's what keeps a man human." The women fell silent. Some looked away to hide their tears. Others stared at him with open disbelief. A few, very few, allowed themselves to smile. As the cowboy stood and tipped his hat before returning to work, Helene opened her notebook again. On a fresh page, she wrote, "If this is America, then we never understood our enemy at all." For the first time since the war began, she felt a faint tremor of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. A fragile, bewildering hope, born not of victory but of witnessing an enemy whose strength came from compassion more powerful than bullets. And somewhere deep inside her, a truth settled like a seed in warm soil. This generosity, this decency, this quiet confidence was the real power of their captors. The moral force Germany could never defeat. The words of the cowboy, "We feed people because it's right," hung in Helene's mind long after he walked away. It was as if the sentence stayed suspended in the warm Texas air, drifting with the dust and sunlight, settling gently into the cracks of everything she once believed. For the rest of the afternoon, she carried the thought with her, feeling it shift something deep inside her chest. As she and the other women folded laundry, swept walkways, and rinsed metal cups under the outdoor pumps, she began seeing the camp and the country beyond its fences with new eyes. Because in that moment of moral awakening, another truth began to take shape. America wasn't just winning the war with weapons. America was winning it with its way of life, and the women could feel it everywhere. The landscape of a different world. From the yard where the women worked, the horizon stretched endlessly, flat, open, golden. Helene had never seen land like this. In Germany, everything was crowded. Villages pressed against villages, fields carved into careful patches, forests cut down to feed war industries. But here, in the middle of Texas, the land looked limitless. Windmills turned slowly in the distance. Herds of cattle moved like dark waves across the grass. and scattered across the plains were farmhouses with smoke rising quietly from chimneys, signaling dinners being cooked in kitchens untouched by bombs. It stirred something old inside her. Ingrid said softly, "It reminds me of childhood. Before the war. Before everything changed." Helene nodded. "It feels like stepping into a memory." But it wasn't a memory. It was real. This was America in 1944, a nation that still sat down to dinner. Late in the day, the women were taken to the far side of the yard to collect linens. Beyond the wire, they could see the lights of a ranch house 2 miles away. Through the windows, framed by dusk, silhouettes gathered around a table. Parents, children, perhaps a grandparent, heads bowed in prayer before supper. The simplicity of it hit Helene harder than any act of kindness yet. A family, together, safe, eating a full meal, laughing, living. Back in Germany, families ate in bomb shelters, if they ate at all. The women watched in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. For the first time, none of them felt like crying. They felt something quieter, deeper, longing. Margaret spoke softly. "It must be something. To live in a place where dinner tables are still whole." No one corrected her. She wasn't commenting on wealth. She was mourning what her own country had lost, and appreciating what her captor's country still had. America's strength was more than steel. Throughout the camp, loudspeakers played faint radio broadcasts. Snippets drifted across the yard. War updates, Red Cross messages, and reports about factories in Detroit hitting new production records. One clip mentioned a town in Illinois where every family had someone serving overseas. Another celebrated women working 12-hour shifts in shipyards. 12 million American soldiers deployed. Millions of women. Rosie the Riverside, Rosie the Welder, Rosie the Riveter, keeping factories alive. And the country still found room to feed prisoners steak. It was astonishing. Helene tried to imagine such unity in Germany. She couldn't. She had never seen it. She had seen fear. She had seen rationing. She had seen desperation and propaganda. But she had never seen the kind of confidence America seemed to radiate effortlessly. The confidence of a nation that believed in itself. A nation that trusted its own people. A nation that didn't need cruelty to prove strength. The contrast pressed down on her like a revelation. The quiet power of 1940s America. As dusk deepened, the cowboys finished stacking wood for the next day's cooking. One sat on an overturned bucket, sipping coffee from a tin cup. Boots crossed comfortably, shoulders relaxed. Another sharpened a knife, humming a tune that drifted lazily across the yard. They weren't tense. They weren't fearful. They weren't suspicious. They looked like men who lived in a country that didn't know the meaning of scarcity, and their ease radiated outward, touching everything. Every fence post, every barracks wall, every word they spoke. Ingrid watched the men work, then whispered to Helene. You can tell they grew up bags packed, eyes fixed on a place they never thought would mean anything to them. Helene held her small notebook to her chest, the same one she had written in on her first morning here, and now, one final entry filled the last page. We came as enemies. We left with a different truth. She closed the book gently, as if closing a chapter of herself she didn't know existed before stepping onto American soil. Leaving a land that had changed them as the trucks rolled toward the gate. The women turned to look back at the camp, the long barracks, the mess hall, the yard where they hung laundry beneath wide Texas skies. Men in Stetson stood near the fence, hands resting easily against their belts. A few raised their hats in silent farewell. Cowboys didn't believe in speeches, but their faces said enough. Helene felt something tighten in her throat. These men had bewildered her, frightened her, and ultimately humbled her. Not with power, not with force, but with steadiness, with decency. With that quiet American conviction that doing the right thing didn't require applause. As the truck jolted forward, Margaret whispered what none of them could deny anymore. America fed us like humans when Germany couldn't. The words lingered in the warm air as the camp shrank behind them. Across the ocean, the story changed shape. Repatriation took weeks. Ships carried the women slowly back across the Atlantic to a homeland they no longer recognized. Germany in 1945 was not a nation. It was rubble stitched together by grief. When the prisoners stepped onto the docks of Bremerhaven, hollow-eyed civilians stared, unable to believe that these returning POWs looked healthier than many Germans who had never left home. Some women faced suspicion, others faced resentment. But when neighbors asked what America was like, when children tugged their sleeves and asked about cowboys and meat and the faraway country that had won the war, the women told the same truth, again and again. America fed us. America treated us with dignity. America was kind when our own nation was collapsing. Many said it quietly at first. Then, they said it with pride, because they were not praising their captors. They were honoring a moral victory that transcended sides. Legacy passed down through generations, years past, then decades. Germany rebuilt itself from scratches of brick and memory. And in living rooms all across the country, former POWs told their children and grandchildren stories that sounded too generous to be real. Stories of cowboys who joked softly and served steak. Stories of guards who lowered rifles and raised eyebrows instead. Stories of Americans who believed that even an enemy deserved a warm meal and a place at a table. Children listened with wide eyes. Grandchildren asked for details, and slowly, very slowly, a bridge grew between two nations that once saw each other as monsters. Some families kept small artifacts, a hand-carved cup from a cowboy, a folded Texas postcard, a recipe written by an American cook. These weren't souvenirs. They were symbols, tiny reminders of the moment when the world proved itself kinder than expected. And then something even more remarkable happened. The children and grandchildren of those POWs, grown now with families of their own, began to travel. They crossed the ocean in reverse. They traced steps back to Texas. Some found the old camps, now long, dismantled. Others found ranches where their fathers once herded cattle under the watchful eye of American men who believed enemies could still be guests. Many wrote letters to the families of those cowboys. Some knocked on doors. Some simply stood on the edge of a field and let the wind carry their gratitude. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't political. It was personal. A message for the America of today. If you listen closely, you can still hear their voices, German prisoners who left the war with a story they never expected to tell. Kindness is America's greatest strength. They said it not because America was perfect, not because even tomorrow would be better than today. That struck Helene hard. In Germany, tomorrow was something to survive, not hope for. The comparison they never asked for. Later that night, after lights out, the women lay in their bunks listening to the hum of distant insects and the faint echoes of laughter from the American guard station. It wasn't rowdy laughter, it wasn't mocking laughter. It was warm, familiar, the sound of men at ease in their own country. Helene stared at the ceiling. America was not perfect. She didn't pretend to believe that. But what she could see, even as a prisoner, was a nation grounded in something she had not felt in years: stability, unity, faith in ordinary goodness. She imagined America decades into the future. Would it still be this unified, this confident, this kind? Or would it change, as all nations do? She would never know, but she could feel the truth of one thought settling deep inside her. America then fed enemies with steak. America today sometimes struggles to feed itself. She wasn't judging. She wasn't criticizing. It was simply the contrast between the world she saw in 1944 and the world she imagined from whispers of a future she could not yet know. Ingrid rolled over and whispered, "Their country is strong in ways ours never was." Margaret added, "Because they built it together." The words warmed the cold space inside the barracks. A few women nodded, letting the thought sink in. A nation. built on an idea, not fear. Through the windows, the moon rose over the plains, casting silver light across the rows of wooden buildings. The camp fell quiet, except for the distant, steady rhythm of a train passing somewhere beyond the horizon. America, in 1944, was moving, always moving, forward, outward, together, factories building, families writing letters, communities rationing, women welding steel, men fighting across 2 oceans, children collecting scrap metal in wagons. A country of millions, each one doing a small part. And even here, in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, that belief spilled over the fences. Even here, in a place meant to contain enemies, America revealed itself. Not with violence, not with arrogance, but with generosity so steady and casual it hurt to look at. The quiet wish. As Helene closed her eyes, she realized the strange truth hidden in her thoughts. She didn't envy America's power. She envied America's spirit. Behind her, another woman whispered what they were all secretly thinking. Gian hunwoch, may nige nai kolai tin than 1940s. And somewhere deeper in the dark, cha ong ho ja lam juoch nhung ju fi thuong. The barracks settled into silence, but the feeling lingered long after, the bittersweet recognition that they had glimpsed a version of America that was both powerful and profoundly kind. A version of America worth remembering, a version worth longing for, a version that, even for the enemy, felt like hope. The day the transport trucks arrived to take them away, the air over Camp Hearn felt strangely still, too still for Texas. No wind, no shifting dust, only the soft hum of cicadas in the grass beyond the wire. The women stood in a quiet line. America was flawless, but because America, at its best, chose mercy over fear, dignity over hatred, humanity over revenge, and the generation that carried those values, the greatest generation, did more than win a global war. They won the moral war. They proved that character could be stronger than ideology, that decency could shake propaganda to its core. What those POWs carried home was not humiliation, it was admiration. What they passed to their children was not bitterness, it was gratitude. What they remembered most was not the barbed wire, it was the barbecue smoke drifting across a Texas evening. The final truth they brought home. Years later, in a small German town, an elderly woman who once sat trembling before a plate of steak in Camp Hearn told her grandson, "I thought I knew America. I was wrong. They showed me what humanity really looks like." And for everyone who hears this story today, for every American watching, remembering, comparing then to now, her words become a quiet reminder. This is who we were. This is who we can be again.